Good evening, and welcome to the Hills Valley Coalition's spring event, Unpacking Family Baggage, Healing from Trauma and Addiction. I'm Jen Charno, and along with Jennifer Zimmerman and Marissa Waters, we are the new leadership for the Hills Valley Coalition.
The Hills Valley Coalition is an alliance of dedicated community members who work to promote a stigma-free and substance-free environment for the families of Hillsdale, Rivervale, Montvale, and Woodcliff Lake. Our mission is to educate and inform the community about stigma-free mental health and to provide a safe and substance-free environment that reduces at-risk teen behavior and supports a family lifestyle that's healthy.
The past 14 months have no doubt taken a toll on all of us. Now, more than ever, our children, parents, schools, and community will need alliances like ours to support, recover, and heal from the ever growing mental health and substance abuse needs that the COVID-19 pandemic has created in our world. So, thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you for attending this evening. Thank you to our mental health care providers and sponsors for helping make tonight possible. It truly takes a village, and we are so thankful and honored to have each and every one of you as part of ours.
Naturally, we were hoping to have tonight's presentation in person, but the universe had other plans. Nonetheless, we are both humbled and honored to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Claudia Black. Dr. Black is a renowned addiction author, speaker, and trainer, internationally recognized for her pioneering and contemporary work with family systems, addictive disorders, and treating complex addiction and mental health issues faced by youths and young adults. Dr. Black's expertise includes treating trauma and addictions. She empowers and strengthens families through treatment and her educational programs that address removing barriers to recovery in order to embrace multi-generational healing.
If you have any questions throughout this evening's presentation, please feel free to add them in the chat box feature. Dr. Black will address these questions at the end of her presentation. In addition, if you did not get a chance to download our handouts, those are also available in the chat box. Now, without further ado, the Hills Valley Coalition proudly presents Dr. Claudia Black.
Hello, everybody. And this says it's going to, let me see, we're going to be just fine in a second. Okay, I think I'm okay. I don't get nervous about standing in front of large audiences of people, but handling this technology has been a real learning curve for me. And I want to say, I think it was over maybe at least 2 to 2.5 years ago that Gail Mangold first reached out to me and asked me if I would come and present. And then, as you know, that was to happen last March 4th. So I want to say thank you to Gail for that initial invitation and for your perseverance and your charm that helped me to say yes to traveling across the United States. I'm actually from the Pacific Northwest, and I'm actually speaking to you from Arizona tonight. And then, as we say, the universe had other plans, and May 4th came and May 4th went. And Gail had said that this event was going to be her grand finale because she was going to retire. Well, Gail did retire. And then, as a consequence of that, the Hills Valley Coalition has been led since then by they introduced themselves, I believe, but I didn't want to just acknowledge Gail. I really also wanted to acknowledge Jen Charno. I wanted to acknowledge Jennifer Zimmerman, and I wanted to acknowledge Marissa Waters as well, because they took on something that's so outside of their box, doing an event like this virtually and at a really stressful time for each and every one of us. So again, truly my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Jen, Jennifer, and Marissa. But first, let me say, doing this virtual, I've done a handful of them, but not too long ago, I watched myself on something that was recorded, and my eyes were going everywhere. And I couldn't figure out what in the world I was doing. And I realized that when I stand in front of an audience, you're speaking this way, and you're speaking down. And I think I'm standing. So if my eyes sort of dart crazy, I'm just trying to speak to you all wherever you're sitting at. And I also doing this virtually need to say, then I'm going to need you to use your imagination a little bit. There's parts of this that would have been much more impactful had I been there with you in person. So again, I think this is still going to be a great night, and again, a pleasure. And at the same time, I must say, I did not come here by myself tonight. I brought with me my mother and my father, and I brought their parents, and I brought their parents, and then I brought my step-parents with me tonight, and then my brother and my sister, and then their in-laws, and then their parents. I mean, I have a whole group of people are here with me tonight. And so what I really want to say is that all of these people who have been a part of my life, and even generations before me, they have really impacted as it is who it is that I am. And what I've been carrying throughout my life is what it is that I instilled from them in the immediate and generationally as well. And a part of the recovery process is for me to take a look at what I've been carrying and to take responsibility for what do I want to keep with me in this lifetime? What am I willing to let go of? And what do I need to create that's going to support me in the way that I'd like to live my life? So I want to expand upon this baggage card analogy here a little bit with you all. I want you to think of life as a journey. And upon conception, each and every one of us was handed a set of genetic building blocks. Now that is the only set we're ever going to get. And that set of genetic building blocks, it will create the baseline for our physical self, the baseline for our intellectual self, and it'll have a lot to do with the personality. It will shape that personality. Now, it's my belief that God's gift is that we came into this world a bundle of spirit. And then we were given the family settings where our stories would begin. Now, there's some people who say that's when the practical joker also came into being. Well, some of us were raised in healthy, functioning family systems where we also had financial security and possibly a lot of community support. Others of us did not have that. We weren't raised in such healthy family systems. We may have not had any financial stability, and we may not have had any community support. But however we experienced those early years, we're all on this journey of life. Now, when you think of a journey, another word for journey is we take a trip. And when people go on a trip, they typically have a destination in mind. They think about where it is they're going. They think about how it is they're going to get there. They think about whether or not anybody is joining them on this particular trip. And they think about what it is they're taking with them. Now, as a young person, as you leave that family system, as you enter into that adult world, most of us were given a map, and it did have a destination in mind. And those destinations can vary from going into the military, a higher level of education. The destination may have to do with relationships or going into a family business. But there are some people who will say they got the map, but there was no clear destination. And then every once in a while, somebody says, I didn't even get the map. So as we take this journey, as we go on this trip, we all carry with us some kind of luggage. And another word for luggage is baggage. And I want you to think about the baggage that you may be carrying. I believe those bags carry our belief systems, our feelings, and they carry our skills. Now, while many of us will have similar maps, and we may even have the same destinations, the reality is the bags that we carry typically are very different from each other. Oh, I forgot this slide. This is what I arrived with today, by the way, when I came here to see you. Now, these are the bags that we carry that are often very different from each other. For some, it could be a brown paper bag that's going to be parched by the elements of the weather or torn apart by the elements of the weather. Other people have hard, sturdy luggage. Other people have soft, medium-sized, very flexible, pliable that you can just jam into any kind of closet. As you're going to see, some people have wheels on their baggage. Other people have levers in which to move their baggage from one place to the other. So what I'm describing for you right now is the shell, is the exterior of the bags. I want you to think as the exterior of the bag that metaphorically that you're carrying. It represents the defenses that you create that contain, hide, and protect your beliefs, feelings, and skills. So I'm going to say that again because it's important. The exterior of your bags, in essence, those are the defenses that contain, hide, and protect your beliefs, feelings, and skills. Beliefs that were developed typically in your growing up years and your young adulthood, beliefs that you have about yourself, beliefs that you have about other people in the world at large, the feelings that you've experienced that you've held on to, maybe because they were very positive, feel-good feelings, you didn't want to let them go. And maybe the other option is you just simply didn't know how to let go of certain kinds of feelings. And then the skills that we develop. And the skills have a lot to do with what our goals are. If my goal is growing up is simply to get one day closer to being 17, 18 years of age so I can get out of this house, those type of skills may be very different than when I'm planning on going to a four-year university and maybe even at a higher level of school after that. So in essence, what I'm asking you to do tonight is I'm asking you to stop and to take a look at what you think you're carrying in your bags. I'm asking you to unpack them and to look inside. What are you carrying in terms of beliefs, feelings, and skills? Now, the possibilities are many. You could be carrying beliefs that say, I deserve respect, I'm strong, I'm very capable, I can take care of myself, I deserve to be happy, people are trustworthy, if I need help, I can ask for it. It's okay to take certain risks. And you know, the world has these wonderful things in which to offer. Then again, you may be operating from beliefs that say, you know, the world is really a scary place. I mean, if you need something, you just better take it. Now, nobody's ever going to listen to anything that I have to say. You know, the world owes me and I'm entitled. I really need someone to take care of me because I really can't take care of myself. If I showed people who I was, nobody would really like me. Then we have feelings. What are you carrying in terms of feelings? Now, in the slide, they're all about the similar size, but sometimes our bag of resentments could be a lot larger than our bags of fear. Or our anger may be a lot larger than our disappointment, so they're not equally always the same size. But what are you carrying in terms of feelings? Do you have disappointments that you've been carrying, and resentments and a sense of hopelessness or guilt? Are you carrying feelings of love, feelings that allow you to feel really good? How large is that bag of hopelessness, that bag of helplessness? But along with this, and I think this is one of the most important questions I'm going to ask you who are listening to me tonight, is who packed your bags? So oftentimes we can easily be in certainly our 20s, but our 30s, 40s, 50s, and older. And the reality is we never packed our own bags. Somebody else packed them for us. We've never stopped to take responsibility for what it is that we're hauling around ourselves. And then I think another really important question here is, are you carrying other people's bags? You know, are you carrying your mother's shame? Are you carrying your father's guilt? Are you carrying your father's rage? You know, so much of the emotional weight we carry is that backpack on our back that's really not even ours. It is somebody else's. So again, we need to stop and to take a look at, are we even carrying our own bags or carrying other people's bags in addition to our own? Now, what we often fail to recognize is that in that luggage, we all have a skill set. We all have a set of tools. So I think the question you need to ask yourself here is, do you have a great number of tools? Because we need a great number. And do you have a variety? Because you can have a great number, but it's all the same tool. It isn't going to be enough to get you where you want to be. Now, the kinds of tools I'm talking about today is, do you have the ability to ask for what you need? Do you have the ability to listen? How are your listening skills, your problem-solving skills, your negotiation skills? Can you see choices that could be available to you? What are those negotiation skills? Can you set healthy limits for yourself? Do you have clarity around what it is that's important? And then we have self-care skills. Are you eating adequately with healthy nutrition? How is your hygiene? Do you wear appropriate clothing given what the weather is? Are you getting the rest and the exercise that you need? Most of the people that I work with in my professional work come into adulthood with their bags weighing on the heavier side. And what I mean by that is they have beliefs that get in the way of their ability in which to feel good about themselves. Those more negative belief systems are going to weigh, they're going to be heavier in weight. And then they have so much of the pain that they've accumulated over the years, and that's heavier in weight. And then when they meet with life's difficulties, because life in the human nature is going to be challenging, they're going to have a harder time coping because of the heaviness of their bags. And then the bags seem to grow as we move through life. You know, what happens is we often just keep picking up more and more unresolved feelings, and the new bags get created. They often come as a result of relationship breakup. We have new bags that come as a result of maybe financial setbacks, the loss of a dream, health issues, and certainly if we have any addictions that are going on in our life within the family and or for ourselves individually. The negative beliefs simply become heavier and our feelings become overwhelming. Now, this is a process and it takes time. We don't even realize that it's happening. As some people become what we think of as material pack rats, we become emotional pack rats. Many of us developed a tolerance for the pain, high tolerance for the pain. When I talk about adult children of alcoholics, I talk about high tolerance for inappropriate behavior, but many of us have developed a high tolerance for pain. And then we're able to maintain that for a period of time while the bags just grow heavier. But then through no fault of our own, our tolerance lessens and we begin to feel the heaviness. You know, that's exactly what happens with substance use disorders as well. People in the beginning, in the earlier middle stages, will have an increase in tolerance to their drug of choice. And then through no fault of their own, but by the nature of the disease, they're going to lose that tolerance. So I want you to think about, you know, if I'm going through an airport and I've got all these bags that I'm carrying on my back and across my shoulders and in my arms, and I just keep picking up other people's bags and more bags of my own, pretty soon I can't make my way through those revolving doors in an airport and down that hallway. So what do? Now, some people would say, well, maybe you go ask for help. Oh, no. We don't do that. We're too rigidly self-sufficient. So no, I just go get a cart. Yeah, I just go get a cart. When we need help, we often get a cart to help carry the bags. And in reality, when I get that cart, it makes life easier for a while. It makes life easier for me to maneuver to where it is that I'm going. But it also, one of the consequences is it's easier for me to keep now putting on more and more bags. And then pretty soon those bags start to fall out of those carts. And now what do? I probably go get a second cart or I get a bigger cart. And then we see the cycle just continue. Now, I'm going to introduce you to three fellow travelers, but before I do that, I just want to introduce you to how lots of travelers can look and their differences here. I'm going to introduce you to three fellow travelers, somebody who's dumped all their beliefs, their feelings, and their skills into a bottle, a pill, or a syringe. This is somebody with an alcohol drug addiction. And then I'm going to introduce you to a woman who has an eating disorder, compulsive overeating. She has dumped her bags, she's dumped into vats of chocolate, sugar, starches. And then I'm going to introduce you to somebody whose bags have accumulated into feelings of despair and hopelessness, and her card is depression. So this is why I need you to use your imagination a little bit. So let's say I was there with you in New Jersey tonight. I would bring David up onto the stage. And I would say to you, you know, when I meet David, first of all, I don't see the cart and I don't see his bags. And that's invisible to me. I've, you know, in essence, put on a distorted set of lenses as a result of my earlier years. So I don't see any of that. And I think to myself, you know, I think David's a nice appearing man. I think David's an attractive man. David has the appearance of some level of success in his life, and I find that attractive. And I think to myself, you know, David is somebody that I'd really like to really get to know. But it doesn't take too long, and suddenly I realized that David just went on a shopping spree, and he bought himself some bags here, some new bags. Yeah, and when I start to look at those bags, he just bought himself some shame. Shame for being out of control with his use of alcohol and cocaine. I mean, after all, he's the kind of guy who thinks he should be able to be in control. And then he bought himself some humiliation. You know, what happened is he ended up in jail. And the humiliation comes not just that he's sitting in jail for the whole weekend, but you know, his wife, she brings their son down to see him in the jail. Yeah. And then one of the biggest bags that he just got himself was anger. I got to tell you, he's really angry. He's really angry at the wife. Why would she bring her son down to see him in that kind of situation? And then, you know, the cop who stalked him, who said it was a taillight, it wasn't a taillight. The cop just had it out for him. You know, and then that wife, if she just wasn't always nagging at him, he wouldn't have to be going out looking like he, you know, wanting to have a good time. Yeah, he wouldn't have needed all that cocaine. Yeah. And then, well, I told you he was financially successful, is what he was in terms of success. So he's the kind of guy who has an attorney on retainer. Yeah, yeah. So who is really angry with us? Why has he sat in jail all weekend long? That attorney should have had him out on Friday night. Attorney doesn't even show up until Monday afternoon. So he's angry at the attorney, he's angry at the cop, he's angry at his wife. But he's carried those feelings a lot in his life. In essence, what I'm saying, the labels on his packages aren't new. Actually, they're quite old. And they're intermixed, if you can just, I want you to sort of visualize this for yourself, with beliefs that say, you know, I don't need anybody. I'm just fine by myself. You can't trust other people anyway. I'll just throw caution to the wind. But tucked into the very bottom of his suitcase is old pulsating resentments. You know, this is a guy who's still resentful about a promotion that he didn't get 8 years ago. Heck, he goes way back. He's still resentful about things that went on in high school, that his brother was a better athlete than him. And today his brother actually has a bigger home than him. Yeah. Inside that box of resentments, though, that's really old, you're going to find a lot of shame and a lot of fear. And with that, the base belief that who I am is not good enough. He has a lot of childhood feelings that he's not worked through. He had a very demanding father, controlling father, perfectionistic father, and David felt that nothing he did was ever good enough for his dad. Always frightened of his dad, frightened of what his dad was going to say, that for him just seemed so demeaning. And then his dad was too busy in his work and didn't come to some school events that were really important for David. And then when he did come up, he seemed to only want to chastise David about, you know, he should have been able to have performed better. So sitting on top of all of this is who I am is not okay. Now, in spite of all this, David's got a tool bag. He's very mentally agile. He's very verbally articulate. He has the ability to put other people at ease. He has quite the charm. But today he only uses them for his addictive behaviors. Well, David's unresolved pain, his negative belief systems by themselves do not cause addiction. But what they do cause is he has this need to medicate. He has this need to anesthetize. And addiction ultimately becomes the carrier for his luggage. Now I want you to meet Jennifer. As I said, Jennifer is a compulsive overeater, and her part is food addiction. She in life has a lot of sadness, and then with that sadness, she compulsively overeats. And then she has sadness because of the compulsive overeating, and then she has guilt. And then she doesn't know what to do with that, so she eats some more, and then she has more sadness and guilt, and she eats some more, and what you have is a cycle that's going on here. But what I want you to imagine is, imagine cement bricks sitting on her shoulder, because this is where she carries so much of her emotional weight, literally. These cement bricks are beliefs that say, I'm not capable, I'm not worthy, I have nothing to offer the world, other people are more important than me, I'm never going to be happy. She learned as a child that in her family, looking good and performing was what was important. That's what was valued in her family. And she felt that the only way she could ever get attention was by looking good and performing. So she was like, she saw herself as the trophy in the family living room. Well, she literally brought home trophies because she became a competitive swimmer, and she brought home those trophies. But in her anger that she had to look good and perform just to find value or feel of any value, she'd compulsively overeat. She'd compulsively overeat because food for her provides solace for a child who's hungry for love and attention. It becomes a friend to a child who's feeling very alone and isolated. And it substitutes for the intimacy that is lacking in her life. Her painful beliefs and her negative feelings, or her painful feelings and her negative beliefs, create or they fuel a distorted relationship with food, and then food addiction becomes her cart. But she's just like David. She's got some skills, but her skills are tucked way in the bottom. They're very rusty, and they haven't been pulled out for a very long period of time. Now, this is Dana, and her cart is depression. What I want you to notice about Dana is notice how she has these hardback Samsonite type luggage. And what that represents for me is she is what I call closeted depressed. And when you're raised with addiction or raised in an even otherwise troubled family system, one of the skills that we learn even more so than other people is how to compartmentalize. We are what I often in my writing refer to as looking good kids. We say to the world, I'm doing just fine in spite of. You will never see into the depth of my despair and or my self-loathing. We become masters at compartmentalizing, and Dana is. You do not see that depression. Her depression, and depression can be about many things, but her depression is about a lot of incomplete sorrow, and I call it pathological grief because she hasn't had the opportunity which to grieve the losses in her life. She, like a lot of people, would have a difficult childhood. Her parents separated. They were never married to each other. They separated from each other when she was really just a toddler, but they both wanted her, so to speak. When I say that, she says she wasn't sure she was ever wanted by either one of them, but she was just what they fought over. So she spent a lot of her childhood going back and forth between her mother's and her father's, living with various step parents and changing school. She felt like she didn't belong anywhere. She didn't feel like she belonged to any of the schools because she changed too quick. She felt like she didn't belong in mother's house or her father's house. So what does a young girl do when you don't have a sense of belonging and you're sad and life just doesn't feel good? Well, for her, she does what a lot of young girls and young boys do as well. She got hooked up into a relationship, and she got married at 17 years of age. And she married a young boy who was only 18 years of age. And very quickly, he started to have affairs. And throughout all of their marriage of 14 years now, she's known about many affairs and not known about the other affairs. Her beliefs are, I'm a failure, I'm inadequate, it will never get any better, and what's the use? And then just living life, losses happen, and she has a miscarriage. She fought so hard to try and get pregnant, and then she has a miscarriage. And she's taken time off work. They don't know why, but she's taken the time off work. She works in a bank and she meets the public, and she stays in bed for the next 3 weeks. And then she taps into an old belief that says, just suck it up. You got to get tough. And she goes back to work. She hasn't talked to anybody about what has happened. Nobody knew that she just had a miscarriage. Certainly nobody knows about all the affairs that her husband's been having. So for her, she is very easy to ignore somebody like Dana, just because she has that ability to look so good on the outside. You're not going to see the anger with herself. You're not going to see the rage that she has with God. But she too, just like the others, she has a toolkit that's very tattered, very tattered. You know, she has some skills. As a child, she spent a lot of time alone, and she was very artistic. I want to tap into her artistic talent as I work with her around her grief and loss. She was very good at working with things with her hands. I want to use that ability to create things with her hands as I work with her as well. Well, I want to say, ultimately, at least 2 of these people reach out for help. It says ultimately 3 reach out for help, but you're going to find that David didn't reach out for very long. And when they reach out for help, what happens is, in this case, the 2 of them, the 2 women are very willing to look at what they're carrying in their bags. They're going to let go of their carts. The carts are the first thing that we need to attend to. They're going to walk through those various feelings, their beliefs. They're going to take a look at their skills. And as they move on, after having been in therapy or a 12-step group or in some kind of maybe psychiatric program, as they move on in their life, they don't get rid of everything at once, because it's going to be a process. It takes some time. But they are going to move on again with skills being very prominent and no cart. What I want you to see about David is he decides that he can't leave anything. Yeah, David initially, he went for help, but he just couldn't leave. He picked up his own cart. His cart's more full than ever. But the other thing he does is he goes over and he grabs some of the stuff from the eating disorder and some of the stuff from the person who is depressed. So now we're going to see somebody who's probably going to have 2 or 3 carts by the next time we see him. So let me go back and start to summarize this. The first step is we need to let go of the carts, because even though all these things may fuel the depression, fuel the various addictions, they become their own primary disorder and they need to be addressed as such. And to have emotional recovery to prevent relapse, we need to challenge the beliefs. Are they helpful or hurtful to how I want to live my life today? Do they support me in a life of recovery? We need, just had a big noise in my house. Excuse me for a second. I think it's the wind though. We need to address the feelings. It's our fear of feelings that often keeps us immobilized and pushing around what I call out of control carts. And we need our skills to be readily accessible. I always tell people, when you pack your bags, put your skills on the top of the bag, on the inside on the top, or you have little side pockets, put them on the outside pockets. As a seasoned traveler, we need to periodically stop and take a look inside and reassess. Now, the truth is, if I'm going to Maine in January, I will pack differently than if I'm going to Hawaii in January. So what I mean by that is, when I go visit my mother, I pack differently than when I go into my boss's office. So this is a process. It's a process that takes time. And after we do go through some of this initial process, then we just need to periodically stop and take a look. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you a bit deeper into this legacy. Trauma and addiction create a toxic dance. They reinforce each other, and then they pass down through the generations. And we certainly need to understand that addiction doesn't just impact the addicted person, it impacts the entire family, shown in this slide. Alcohol and drugs are like dominoes. They knock down the person who knocks down everyone, including themselves. As I speak about trauma in the addictive family today, this is in no way meant to take away from the gifts of your family or the gifts of your culture, your heritage. It is so often addiction that has done much to destroy that which is sacred and the beauty and that which is meaningful in your families. Nobody asks to be addicted. Nobody willfully says, I'm going to go live with somebody where there's an active addiction. Nobody deserves to live with the fear and the shame that we live with when we live with trauma and addiction. Again, not the addict and not the family member. And the recovery and the healing that many of us know, and that many of us are actually in our work bringing to families and communities, is something that deserves to be celebrated. So I hope just your presence here tonight is a part of honoring this recovery process. I want to introduce you to a woman whose name is Therese. None of the names that I use tonight are anybody's real names. So the first thing I want you to know about Therese is, when we meet Therese, we do not meet her as the wife of 2 different men who are addicted. We don't meet her as the daughter in an addictive family system. She garners our attention when she shuffles into a community mental health center on the arms of a neighbor. This is after 2 different divorces from 2 different addicted men to substances. Until this last divorce, she's never reached out and she's never asked for help until she's actually experiencing what is a major depression. It is a profound major depression. When she speaks, you cannot hear her. It is so soft, and she can't enunciate. She's slurring. When she walks, she shuffles. She has very diminished self-care, very poor self-care, and very diminished expectations. So at the Community Mental Health Center, they do treat her with antidepressants. And I think given the state she was in, that was indicated. But that's all they do. And then they sent her out. Well, it's 2 more weeks. She's gone to the emergency room 2 different times in panic attacks. She's in a grocery store and she's having such difficulty making the most basic of decisions, like which cereal should she be buying for her young children, and ends up thinking she's having a heart attack and taken to the hospital. She goes back to the Community Mental Health Center. And they realize they have a co-occurring disorder. She's not just depressed, but she's anxious. So now they change the medication to include anti-anxiety medication. And then they send her on her way. Now, I'm going to suggest, and it's just my bias, but I'm going to suggest that the prognosis for her is going to be pretty poor if they do not look at the underlying issues for that depression and that anxiety, and what they paid no attention to, the fact she's getting into relationships repetitively with addicted men. Now, I want you to meet this last husband. He's a drug addict, and her first husband is an alcoholic. It is not a coincidence that she married these men when we take a look at the family that she came from. She was raised in a very physically threatening home. Her father was very shaming towards her. He was very belittling. He verbally shamed her. He favored her siblings he favored the siblings over her, and it was very clear. He controlled her dress. He actually even cut her hair himself. And on a nightly basis, she listened to her parents do a lot of arguing, and mostly her mother pleading and begging. A mom would do anything, she said, to appease dad, just try and keep him from not being violent. But what we sometimes fail to realize is it's not a coincidence that these men married her when we take a look at the family that they came from. I'm just making this larger here. And actually, when we take those two families that the two husbands came from, it's really going to get represented in this genogram as we build this genogram up. I want you to know that she has a brother and a sister. The sister was slightly older than her, 18 months, and died in a car accident when she was only 9. A car accident when she was with some neighbors. And the brother's been a compulsive overeater since he was a young child, and today is still a compulsive overeater. And now we're going to look at the grandparents. You're going to see on father's side, influenced by a lot of chronic poverty, as was one of the husbands, by the way. You're going to see a premature death. On the mother's side, you're going to see process addictions as well as substance addictions, your food addictions, your alcoholism, your gambling, and you're going to see rageful behavior here. Trace didn't get to where she's at in this profound depression and anxiety overnight. Her childhood history was truly her training ground long before she entered either of these addictive relationships. This is what she would learn as a child. She would learn to overlook. What I mean by that is to deny, to rationalize, to minimize behavior that was hurtful towards her. She would learn to appear cheerful even when she was hurting. She'd learn to make excuses for that hurtful behavior coming from others. She learned how to avoid conflict, how to tolerate the inappropriate, how to prioritize the needs of others over her own. She learned to caretake others, and she found herself at fault for the family problems. She learned to discount her own perceptions. She had a hard time seeing that options could be available. And if she found that she was at fault, then she felt she was the one who had to have the answers. She certainly learned it wasn't okay to ask for help. And besides that, it wasn't like there was a lot of people wandering through here making themselves available for me to ask. And she learned to accommodate. She's reared to be the absolute perfect candidate for partnering with an addict. And these, what we often call codependent traits, are going to enable an addict to be able to act out their addiction with very little disruption. Now, at the time she got some help, I mentioned that she had 2 children. So I want to go back to this. I want you to see the young children here. And I want you to see not only how she was impacted, but I want you to see the generational impact on these 2 young children. It's what I said when I arrived here today. I came with all of these people that I don't even know that are a part of influencing who I am. Now, you can walk into any community mental health center, almost any primary health care office, and you're going to find literature provided by the state of New Jersey, New York, whatever state you might be in right now. You might find material that's dispensed by the federal government, and you'll often find one-page or pamphlets about how to prevent high-risk behavior or how to prevent alcohol and drug abuse amongst our young people. And typically, it will say something along this line. And I'm not going to read all of that to you, and you do have that in your handouts. But that when we engage in this kind of parenting practice, our children are going to have far greater resiliency and going to be able to withstand a lot of the pressure they may have in which to want to use or actually just act out in difficult behavior as well. Well, what I want to say is I'm very skeptical that Trace is capable of this. And the two fathers, they're not even wanting to be in their kids' lives. She had a child with each man. And so this isn't going to come from them. And the grandparents is a very weakened generational family structure. So these kids aren't going to have this experience. The genogram I just showed you shows generational repetition, and the common thread throughout the generations is going to be toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences, and that's going to result in trauma responses. Now, left untreated, we're going to see Trace again. We'll see her again. The word trauma often conjures up a mental picture of a car accident, a terrorist attack, an armed robbery. But for many people, though, the terrorist attack, the natural disaster is truly within their own family system. Now, at times of trauma, the natural response we understand is to run from that which is so traumatic. But in the beginning, as we started taking a look at traumatic events, you see people running from that which was traumatic. And then we realize in time, they're not just running from, they're running towards. So where were they running towards? They're running towards safety. And for most of them, that meant home. But where do you run towards for safety if that which is traumatic exists within that family system? When it is not physically safe, psychologically safe to be who you are, to own your own truth, to say how it is you feel, what it is you see, then you move into those various trauma responses, the fight, the flight, or the freeze. When you are 10 years of age and your father is in your face telling you, you're no good, he never wanted you to begin with, his face is distorted, it's all red, he's spitting as he's screaming at you. This is no time to be able to flee. I mean, he's got an adrenaline rush that's so high right now, he's got extensions to his arms, so you're not going to be able to flee. Certainly it's not safe to fight, so freezing is the only response here. So whichever response people move towards, the fight, the flight, or the freeze, know that that's a survival mechanism. It's a survival reflex, and we are hardwired. It's just that it's very hard for us in these families to be able to flee and fight. So freeze is very often where it is we go. Now today we know that the body cannot tell the difference between an emotional emergency and something that's physically dangerous. When triggered, it responds by pumping out stress chemicals that allow somebody to be able to stand and fight or to be able to flee the situation. In the case of childhood problems, again, when the family itself becomes the source of that stress, there's no opportunity to fight or to flee. So you do what you can, and mostly you just freeze. Now, we're born into this world only partially hardwired by nature for what we call self-regulation. I'm going to say this again. We are born into this world only partially hardwired by nature for self-regulation. It's very much up to nurture to do the rest. And it's through tiny, soothing interactions with caregivers that children absorb the skills of what we call emotional self-regulation. They absorb those skills from their interactions with the people in the parenting role, the people in the mothering role, the fathering role. And then children internalize the safety that comes with those experiences, the experiences of a regular routine, a calm environment, a soothing touch, a soothing voice. And it's through the acquisition of those experiences, a child learns to regulate their emotions. But they not only learn to regulate their emotions, they learn to regulate other base functions such as mood, appetite, libido, motivation, and the capacity for bonding. Now think about what I just said. We're talking about the need for self-regulation and to be able to internalize the ability in which to do that. But that impacts mood. That can lead us down to depression or anxiety when we can't self-regulate. Libido could lead us to problems sexually. Food can certainly lead to problems of distorted relationship with food. All of the things that I work with in the treatment field is what I've just talked about here. Now, I want to show you, this is a picture of our autonomic nervous system. And throughout the day, we have moments of increasing and decreasing arousal. And if we stay within what's called this optimal arousal zone, or it's called a window of tolerance, we can we'll still have nervous system fluctuations while still having the capacity to regulate ourselves. So what that means is, in the face of conflict, in the face of stress and problems, I still have the sense that I'm okay, that who I am is okay. I feel the stress, I don't like the problem, it doesn't necessarily feel good, but I don't lose myself in this process. Now, this is what we look like when we're highly codependent, when we have an addiction, when we have any kind of anxiety going on or depression going on. We lose the ability to stay within that window of tolerance here. This is so often who it is that I'm working with. People tend to either move into a hyperarousal or a hypoarousal. And you will fluctuate between the two, but most people will have more time in one versus the other. If you are chronically dysregulated long enough, so think about this as a child growing up, we're talking about months and years. If you're impacted by addiction and trauma, if you are in this dysregulated state long enough, you're going to become stuck, regardless of whether or not the original pain is present. You know, when I did my work around adult children of alcoholics, that initial work, what I was talking about was the delayed process. You did not see the negative impact of growing up with addiction until people were almost mid-20s and older. And that's what this is saying, is that you take this with you, even if you are no longer in the confines of what it is that was so traumatic for you. So I just wanted to give you my definition here of trauma. When overwhelmed by a threat and you're not able to successfully defend yourself, you become stuck in a survival mode. That continual state, be it hypo or hyper of arousal over time, begins to form the symptoms of trauma. Greek word for trauma means defeat, a wound, a hurt. It is not a disease or a condition. It is the body and the brain's response to a severe, painful experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. Now, not too long ago, in the last year and a half, some research came out from our federal government, and it said that 75% of us will all experience something that is traumatic in our life. Now, I sort of grinned when they said that, because I think just the human experience, probably 100% of us will experience something that's traumatic in our life. But the point that the research would go on to say is that of those 75%, only 25% show ongoing traumatic stress. Now, that is what is important. Of the people who do experience trauma, only a quarter of them most likely will show ongoing traumatic stress responses. So I wanted to tell you why it is that some people show greater resiliency versus vulnerability to that which they're subject to. And one is the fewer previous stressors that somebody has, usually the more resilient they're going to be. So let's say we're in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, and we have two families that have lived in the same neighborhood, and they build one of those underground safety places when the tornado comes. And the tornado is coming, the two women who are at home, and everybody else is away at that moment. The two women come and they run to the shelter together, and they hear horrible noises. They don't know when they come out of that shelter what it is they're going to find in terms of what's left of their homes. They huddle, holding each other. One of those women is in a relationship where there's domestic violence, and the other woman's in a much healthier, stable relationship. I can guarantee you the woman who's in the relationship with the domestic violence is going to be much more traumatized by this tornado than the other woman. Whether or not you get support at the time of the stressor. Now, we know that many kids may be raised in a home where there's an active addiction, but there may have been somebody else significant in their life, like a grandparent, or maybe an uncle, or maybe it was a neighbor who would come in and play a strong role throughout that child's life. It would alleviate them taking on some of those trauma responses. And the older somebody is at the time, the more resiliency they will have. So the younger the child is as they're exposed to the behavior with living with addiction, the more they're going to be impacted. Trauma is more negatively impactful when it is repeated, when it is unpredictable. Now, there's a caveat here. In the alcoholic home, we know it's going to happen again. We know our father's going to go into a rage. you know, our mother's going to do such and such again. We just don't know when. So on one level, it's predictable, but we still don't know when. That's the unpredictability. When it's undergone in childhood and when it is perpetrated by somebody who's supposed to be caring towards you. Now, while I believe that the greatest identifier of dysfunction in families today is addiction, when I speak of trauma, there are certainly other family systems that will also experience trauma that don't necessarily have active addiction in those families. You can have a home where there's physical and sexual abuse without active addiction. You can have homes where people are verbally rageful without active addiction. But you also have trauma in homes that are chronically less than nurturing, something not as blatant as what I just described, just chronically less than nurturing. In homes where the structure is very rigid, there's a lack of fairness. In families where there's enmeshment, or families where you have the opposite of enmeshment, there's severe disconnection. The common loss, or the common denominator in those types of families, is loss on a chronic basis at that time in life when a child is developing their worth and their identity. What is most significant about trauma in the context of addicted families is that it is chronic. Now, the blatant traumas in this addictive family system would be physical abuse. Now, the ultimate act of physical abuse is when somebody's killed, and certainly that may have occurred in some of your families. But the physical abuse is more apt to be the pushing, the shoving, the kicking, the pinching, the slamming somebody up against the wall until the teeth rattle, terrorizing car rides. And we need to remember that a child who's being abused by his or her parents, they don't stop loving their parents. They stop loving themselves. I used to think that so much depression that I was seeing in people I was working with was about unresolved grief. And I think a lot of it is. But so much of the depression I see today is related to the self-loathing and the self-hate that permeates people who live in the way that I'm describing this afternoon. Now, a more subtle form of physical abuse is the witness factor. When you're witnessing something emotionally overwhelming, it's the helplessness in the sense of being overwhelmed when you're witnessing something that is overpowering. This is a dynamic that actually has been looked at for a couple of centuries, starting back within the 1800s, and not 2 full centuries, but about a century and a half. And it was first recognized when there were so many railway accidents and people would be injured and then people would not be injured, and they showed the same symptoms as if they had a physical injury. And they called that railway spine. Well, then we had shell shock, and then we had soldier's heart in the Civil War. It was in the Vietnam conflict, as they call that. They recognized with PTSD, if you took 2 soldiers who had equal combat experience and they both were in the same incident, one was physically injured and one was not, the one that was not physically injured was actually the one more apt to have post-traumatic stress than the one who was physically injured. Another form of trauma is the bullying. Now, while for so many people, bullying begins in the schoolyard, but if addiction is a part of the family, I can almost guarantee you if somebody's bullied, it's going to begin at home, on the part of parents, on the part of siblings, typically older siblings, but not always. Now, bullying has existed for generations, but with the advent of the internet, the impact of bullying that takes place outside of the home is much more severe. But what I'm saying, if you're raised in an addictive home, you're very likely to get the bullying in the confines of the home. And then that sets you up to be offended in the school setting. So what I wanted to say again, back to the internet, there was a time at school when you were bullied by 1 or 2 people on the playground, the hallways, the bathroom. And as painful as it was, when you got home, you still carried with you the emotional pain, but the bullying had stopped. Well, now that's not true. By the time you get home, the bullying's all over social media sites and various aspects of the internet. And now people from all over the country are chiming in and denigrating you and humiliating you and telling you you should die and that you're ugly and you're never going to have any friends. Children at risk of being bullied, kids who already are depressed, anxious, or have low self-esteem, that's a lot of kids raised with addiction. and heaven help you appear different from your peers in some way that's not perceived as cool. Maybe you don't get along well with your peers. You're seen as annoying. You're seen as provoking. You antagonize others. But what's most likely is those who are bullied the most, is the better way of saying that, is if you are already physically challenged, if you're on the autism spectrum, or if you're part of the LGBTQ plus population. Those are the ones most apt to experience being bullied. Sexual abuse, again, 1 out of every 4 females in our country today before the age of 18 is being sexually abused in her growing up years. 1 out of every 6 to 8 males before the age of 18 is being sexually abused by somebody within the home, or could easily be somebody outside of the home. When I work with adults who've been sexually abused, very often it's more than one offender, not one offender necessarily at the same time. Now, if I'm working with a younger person, there may only be one offender at that time, but by the time they get into adulthood, if we find out that there's been sexual abuse, there's often been more than one offender. Now, children in addictive homes are more at risk for sexual abuse, more at risk for sexual abuse by somebody outside of the system, because they're often striving for attention, and people outside of the system will groom them under the guise of friendship. And if these kids are in need of friends and attention, they will respond to that initially. Children of addiction are less apt to speak up because the fear of not being believed. They're already in a family where the truth isn't supported. They're already learning how not to trust their own perceptions. They're already confused about healthy boundaries, who's responsible for what. And they're already internalizing a sense of shame. What I mean by that is that who I am is not okay. So if I already experience shame and something else happens that is shameful, shame put upon already existing shame fuels a sense of powerlessness. I also want to speak to grief and loss. My nose itches, excuse me. I see a lot of grief and loss that comes with death in the family system when there is addiction. Just last week, I sat in a group of 7 young men, 4 of them had lost people in their growing up years. One lost a father as the victim of a drinking and driving accident, where he was the victim of the drinking and driving accident. One lost a mother due to suicide and actually found the mother at the time that she suicided. Again, the horror stories really just continue on. Now, if there's addiction in the family, there's far greater likelihood of death due to accidents. If there's addiction in the family, there's far greater likelihood of death due to overdoses, death due to health issues, death due to suicides. But now with the opiate epidemic, the likelihood of losing a family member to an overdose is extremely high. Kids are losing parents, parents are losing kids, kids are losing siblings. Again, the horror stories. Not just too long ago, I was working with a 21-year-old girl, and her using buddy and she are sleeping together. When she wakes up, he's dead in bed next to her. Or the 22-year-old who introduced his brother to drugs and his brother overdosed and died, and the guilt that comes with that. The grief around this is profound and it's complicated because there's usually anger ahead of time, confusion before the death ever happens. Then the death happens, and then there's anger and confusion still, and then there's guilt put on top of that. I want to say to anybody listening to this who has lost somebody through death, that one, I want to give you my condolences. I also want to say, please be as compassionate with yourself as you can be. And please don't stay isolated in your grief. I also want to say, for those of you who work in our field, we must recognize that not only are family members in a grief process that's profound and complicated, but it's a traumatic experience. And it's not just an individual experience, it's a family experience, and it's a collective experience. And in many cases, it's generational and historical as well. But some of this trauma comes from something that is much more subtle than everything I've talked about, and that is emotional abandonment. When I talk about emotional abandonment, I'm talking about living in a family situation where there's this always sense of being on the outside looking in. You're going to be ridiculed. There's chronic unrealistic expectations. Maybe there's perfectionistic controlling parents. Let me say that controlling and over-involved parents typically leave kids feeling very angry and very alienated. One young man said to me, my mother is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Being everywhere is about intrusion, and being nowhere is about a lack of connection. Being everywhere is about intrusion, and being nowhere is about a lack of connection. Intrusion is about the needs of parents. Support is about the needs of the child. I see a lot of abandonment, emotional abandonment with acrimonious divorce, absentee parents, and they even be absent for a variety of reasons. Absent in your addictions, absent in your depression, absent due to work, very stressful professional, obligations, etc. Where parents are preoccupied with something other than the parenting. A couple of ways of looking at this. You're on one end of the spectrum here, you have total rejection. On the other end, you have absolute acceptance. Well, it's never all or nothing. Somewhere in between, there's emotional unavailability and indifference to somebody's wants and needs. Now, I didn't say parental, but I'm talking about as a child growing up, is parental emotional unavailability and parental indifference to a child's needs and wants. But I didn't put parental there because you can use this in the context of working with coupleships. But I do to myself today that which was once done to me. So if I experienced any form of abandonment in my growing up years, I often abandon myself today in the same ways in which I was abandoned. So abandonment can occur in one's growing up years. Abandonment can occur in the context of a coupleship. And I can abandon myself, and I often will until I'm in that recovery process. When you have to hide a part of who you are in order to be acceptable, or maybe there was no acceptance to be had, I did this to protect myself. So what do I mean by that? Was it okay in this family for you to make mistakes, or did you learn at a really young age that if you made a mistake, there was something inherently wrong with who you were, that it was not okay? Was it okay in your family to show feelings, or did you learn that only certain feelings were okay in this family? Is it okay for you to have needs, or were only the needs of the addict the one that were able to be acknowledged in this family? And not as frequent, but if it's true, was it okay for you to have accomplishments, successes, or did that get seen as some kind of betrayal? And who do you think you are? You're going to go on to school and get a college degree. You think you're better than me now? We get a lot of that at times. That's what I mean by having to hide your accomplishments. Other forms of abandonment is when somebody's disappointed with you and they attack your whole being, your worth, your value versus what you did or didn't do. When another expects you to be an extension of themselves, fulfilling their dreams, not allowing you to have your own. When that other person wants you to take responsibility for their thoughts and feelings. When parents' esteem is predominantly, is the key word here, derived through a child's behavior. When children are treated as peers with no parent-child distinction. Or I take on shame when I perceive my family is different. I have a family member who's different in a manner that is not acceptable. But I also want to say that abandonment occurs today when somebody is rejected for who they are in their sexual orientation. We'd like to think that in our communities that we have progressed and that we're much more open and much more inclusive. But I have to tell you, particularly because I'm specializing now in working with young adults, that there are so many young adults out there that they do not want to risk the rejection of their parents. They don't want to risk the rejection sometimes of their faith community and struggle greatly with a willingness in which to come out and live with such incredible shame, feeling major anxiety, depression, and suicidality. All of this that I have talked about sets people up for a shame core, and that shame core gets acted out in a whole host of ways. Shame, the belief that who I am is not okay, to think of myself as defective, less than, inadequate, pathetic, broken. Those are just some of the words. To live with shame is to live with a profound sense that you're unlovable. It's to live with a sense of defeat. You never feel good enough in which to belong. So what happens is we act it out. We act it out internally and externally. And then this family legacy continues. The family legacy continues as people act out what I call spiritual and emotional bankruptcy, often running, and often seeking medicators, not realizing they are on a well-trodden path that comes most naturally. I mean, just think about what alcohol and drugs can do. Alan said to me, he said, when I was 11, I took my first drink and I hated the taste. But I felt the glow. And he said, Claudia, I had a hole in my stomach that was so big, and alcohol and drugs were the only thing that would fill it up. I drank and I used to get absolutely blithering numb. Now, today, what we recognize is that the legacy may not be the same drug of choice that you were raised with, but it will be a part of the continuum of addictive disorders. So let's say my father was an alcoholic, and I'm not going to be an alcoholic, and I don't drink at all. But what happens is I end up addicted to cannabis. My mother was a pill addict, somebody says. So, I stay away for that, and they end up being alcoholic. And then you see the same kind of thing. You see, no, I didn't marry an alcoholic, but I married a compulsive gambler. No, I didn't marry a drug addict, but I married somebody who was a sex addict. So again, the continuum of addiction perpetuates itself. I also want to say, seldom do we see somebody today with just one addiction. There's usually going to be a combination of addictions. Maybe at the point they go into treatment or a 12-step program with the addiction that they're furthest along in the progression, the addiction that is causing the greatest crisis for them. But many times there's another addiction. And it's just going back to that baggage card analogy I showed earlier. David starts off with one drug addiction and using lots of different kinds of drugs. But in his path, he's going to ultimately end up with an eating disorder, and he's also going to end up with a co-occurring depression as well. Very often when you work with somebody who ends up being a gaming addict, they're going to have a porn addiction. Sometimes they're also anorexic. Oftentimes working with sex addicts, they're also drug addicts. Working with gamblers, they're also alcoholic. They're also sex addicts. As one man said to me, I'm an addiction binger and trader. An addiction binger and trader. And then you see that legacy continue in what we call trauma repetition, what we saw with Therese, picking up one addictive husband after the other. I want to say a couple of things about that when it's a substance use disorder. If I'm raised in a family where there's a substance use disorder and I'm married or get in committed relationships with somebody where that's the issue. One is, it may be a different drug of choice, so I don't see it for what it is. Two, at the time I was old enough for memory, my father and mother were in middle and late stages. So that's what I saw that represented addiction. When I met you, we could be younger than that. So you may have the same drug of choice as my parent, but I don't see it for what it is because it's early stage. And then there's that old, I know that she had a problem with pills just like my mother, but I loved my mother and she was a good woman. I can handle this. And those things are true. In spite of that parent's addiction, you may very well have loved that person. They may have a lot of really lovely aspects to who they are, but that also speaks to diminished expectations. And I just want to say, I think you deserve to live a life without addiction. Sharon grew up with two addicted parents, and today she is an addict, addicted to alcohol and other drugs, and she's also identifies as a relationship and love addict. And she said to me, she was in her late 40s, she said, Claudia, I have been married and divorced. I have been married and divorced 5 times. Yeah, 5 times. And what I just realized is I never divorced the right man to begin with. And that is my dad. That just sort of summarizes what I said about, when we don't do that work, that underlying work, it's a setup for this kind of repetition. Oh, and speaking of that, I said a little bit earlier, guess what? Remember earlier I said, left untreated, somebody's going to see Therese again because she got treated pharmacologically, but she didn't get treated for the underlying issues. So guess what? Guess who sees her next? It's when her son goes into an addiction treatment program. That's when she's seen again. Now, he's not too motivated. It's an alternative to spending time in jail. So his prognosis is a little bit difficult. Over the years, Mom did not marry. She did intermittently stay on her antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. And as a consequence, life was a bit more stable. He said she was a pretty decent mom. I mean, she let me do what I want. Well, what that meant is he dropped out of school when he was 16. He just sort of just didn't keep going. He was dealing drugs in an upstairs bedroom of a condo that they live in. The daughter had already moved out of the home prematurely, and just went to live with another family. He was dealing drugs in an upstairs bedroom, and that mother had not walked up those stairs in 3 years to even see what was going on in that bedroom. Dealing drugs and using drugs. He said, we're pretty united, and you and I, if we're professionals, we say, well, they're probably very enmeshed. He says, it's us against the world, and life has just been tough for both of us, and we never get any breaks. So now I want to go back to this I showed you earlier. And earlier, these were all of the issues that set Therese up to end up in hurtful relationships, intimate relationships. And then when she gets into those hurtful relationships, it's these very issues that help her to enable that other person's acting out. And then as a parent, because she's not addressed any of these issues, this is how she's going to enable her son. So these characteristics have followed her from childhood into her relationship issues and into her parenting issues. In essence, what Therese has done is she's put her head in the sand, trying not to think about what it is that's happening, ascribing to the don't talk rule, the rule of silence. Do not talk honestly about what it is that is going on. Now, I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to start to bring my piece to a close. So if you have some questions, put them in the chat box. So I want to review for you what it is that I've described so far. So I'm going to start with the story of Kim. Kim experiences trauma growing up in an alcoholic home. Her father does get sober when she's 12 years of age. But up until then, it's a very acrimonious family situation. She has a mother who's very hypercritical. She actually has a mother who's very preoccupied with Kim's weight and how it is that she looks. Starting in kindergarten, she starts putting her on a scale on a daily basis. And as Kim said, there must have been a prevention plan because I was a pretty skinny kid to begin with. Well, as I said, her dad goes to rehab and he stops his drinking. So like a lot of people, she just assumes things are going to get better. But things do not get better. 3 months after dad is in recovery, mom leaves the home to go be with a boyfriend that she's had for the last 3 years. Now, at this point, Kim's mom and Kim's dad just spend a lot of time continuing to argue in a very acrimonious divorce that she's subject to listening to and pulled into the courts. And now we see bulimia nervosa. She's exercising to keep herself extremely thin, compulsively exercising. She's binging on junk food. She's doing the vomiting. And she begins to party, drinking excessively and starting to take some large amounts of opiate. One night, when drunk, she passes out and she's raped by several guys at a party. The trauma continues. One of them posts a video of the rape on social media. Her humiliation, her shame, her inability to reach out to her parents continues, as does the partying, the binging, the drinking, the drug use, and more sexual assaults. By the time she's 23 years of age, she's using, she's addicted to heroin, she's addicted to alcohol, she's made 2 suicide attempts, and she's also had an overdose where she was saved by Narcan. That pretty much summarizes sort of where this can go and how they interplay with each other when we don't have an intervention somewhere in this process. This is simply a summary for you. It will also summarize what it is that I've said, and I'm not going to read through it, but I like the visual part of it. I think it brings together pretty much what I've said so far. So let me speak to recovery. First and foremost, it begins with identifying the carts. I've already said that, but I'm going to say it again. Your cart could be codependency. It could be an eating disorder. It could be depression. It could be anxiety, post-traumatic stress. And not everybody has a cart. I need to say that as well. Not everybody has a cart. Recovery means a willingness in which to reach out for help. We always say addiction is a disease of disconnection, and recovery is about connection. But even the impact of that as well is a disease of disconnection, a disconnection of self and a disconnection with others. The willingness to get help, it could be through your local community mental health centers. It certainly could be through an addiction treatment program. It could be through a trauma resource center, a family service agency, a grief support group, a 12-step group, a therapist. And in doing that work, it means a willingness to take a look at what you're carrying. What are you carrying in terms of feelings, beliefs, and skills? And to take responsibility for what it is that you want to carry in this life. And that gets represented when you have a commitment to ongoing recovery process. When I ask people, what are your recovery practices? And they can't tell me what they are, I can pretty much tell you you're not engaging in recovery practice. I'm going to walk you through a 7-step process that I think will bring you to that recovery. First of all, I want to say that the therapeutic process when you've had trauma is going to be an eclectic approach. And we talk about it being a bottoms-up, top-down approach. And what we're talking about is regulating that nervous system and calming down that fiery limbic system, the emotional part of our brain, so that in essence, our prefrontal cortex, the part of us that allows us to reason, think through, and problem solve, can do what we want it to do. So, sorry, I'm going to bypass that. So, throughout your recovery process, I'm going to encourage you to do some kind of grounding work. Many of you are already doing that. Grounding is what helps to regulate that nervous system, and it calms down that limbic system. It's a necessary foundation for all the other layers that I'm going to talk about. So it's something that we do on an ongoing basis. Grounding exercises are not rocket science. They're usually fun. They're usually pleasurable. They often don't cost anything. Some people actually have already made careers out of them, and that may be why you have the strengths that you have. So the examples of grounding techniques: to engage in gardening, time in nature, knitting, the research regarding craft work and knitting in terms of lessening the depression, lessening the anxiety. And what is happening is it's changing the chemicals in our brain. Any kind of meditation, mindfulness practice, singing, dancing, again, you can read these for yourself as well. But I wanted to, the research is saying with the benefits of mindfulness practice, these are the many benefits. If I could only have one of these benefits, it is worth the mindfulness practice. And for me, it's worth less emotional reactivity. If I'm not busy being so emotionally reactive, then I might be able to pay attention to what other resources are available to me. From grounding, and again, we're going to bring the grounding throughout all of this, we need to explore the narrative. And what I mean by that is, what happened that hurt you? What didn't you get that you needed? Now, some people will say, I wasn't raised in a home where there was this death in the family or sexual abuse or physical abuse. It was all more subtle. And they're probably then identifying more with different forms of emotional abandonment. When it's more subtle, it's often what did you need that you didn't get versus what happened to you. The purpose in exploring the narrative is to undo a denial process. If you continue to minimize, discount, and rationalize what it is that happened in the first 20 years of your life, that is a skill set you will continue to take with you, minimizing, discounting, and rationalizing. So a part of the purpose of exploring the narrative is to let go of that skill of denial. Now, we often think we're not in denial. A little girl said to me when we were talking about denial, because that's a big word for a little kid. She said, denial is when we pretend things are different than how they really are. So if you don't like the word denial, do you pretend things are different than how they really are? Because we take this right with us into every other area of our life. So exploring the narrative has a lot to do with lessening the skill of denial. It also has to do with identifying the losses and then being able to grieve those losses. And as you're going to see, this isn't linear. We don't do grounding, then explore the narrative, and then move into our emotions, because we're going to, as you explore the narrative, you will begin to experience those emotions. There are 2 big resistances to recovery. I'd really like recovery, but I'd like to do it by myself, thank you. And I'd like it to be pain-free. When you allow other people to be a part of the process, then you're going to be able to walk through that pain and you will come out that other side. When it comes to feelings, we go to great lengths to avoid our feelings. I'm going to give you 4 questions I want you to think about. what one or two feelings are the easiest for you to show? That you'd have no problem if we were together letting me know that you were experiencing them. Think about that for just a second. Okay, hold on to that. That's just a warm-up. That just gets you thinking about feelings. What one or two feelings are really difficult for you to show? The last feeling that you really don't want me to see that you may be experiencing, what would that be? For some people, you don't want me to see how scared you are. Some people don't want me to see how angry you are. Some people don't want me to see how sad you are. So take that feeling that's really difficult. Think about it for a second. What's the feeling that's difficult? You don't like people to see that. Take that feeling that's difficult. How do you mask or defend against it? So maybe you use humor to mask your fear. Maybe you use humor to mask your anger. Maybe you use intellectualize to mask your sadness. So how do you defend against that feeling that you don't want other people to know about? I'm going to suggest to you that it's easier for you to recognize the defense than to know the feeling. So when you're not good at knowing what your feelings are, and you can answer that question, I don't want anyone to know when I'm angry, and what I do when I'm angry is I use humor, I become caustic, I remove myself. Pay attention to the defense because it's easier to recognize, and then ask yourself what you're angry about, what you're afraid of, or what you're sad about. And then the last question is, what is the fear of what would happen should you get in touch with the depth of that feeling? What is the fear of what would happen should you get in touch with the depth of the feeling, the one that you are so afraid of letting people see? And I can tell you that oftentimes, if you do an immediate response, it doesn't make sense. You say, I'm afraid that if I showed you my fear, that you just get up and walk out of the room and just not even engage with me. I'm afraid that if I showed you my anger, you'd slap me across the face. And you say, but that's not true because, you're an adult and I'm an adult and you're not going to do that. But that was the fear as a child. So what I'm really saying to you is that belief is a belief that comes from history and it's never been challenged. And it's in your unconsciousness today. And so that's what's keeping you from the ability oftentimes in which to own those feelings. You need to know what that belief system is, and then you need to question how realistic is that today. And for therapists, their job is to create safety, is to create a safety container. And when it comes to feeling, it has to do with pacing people. And when people are trying to address these issues, sometimes we're so afraid that the old image that we're going to take batakas and have to scream. You don't have to scream. It doesn't have to have a high catharsis. Today, people do a lot of their emotional work in artwork, in journaling, in writing, in different kinds of therapy called SE, somatic experiencing, or with the use of EMDR. A heavy catharsis is not necessary. I want you, before I go into layer 4, may you feel the vulnerability of your childhood, but experience the strength of your adulthood. May you feel the vulnerability of your childhood, but in essence know the strength of who you are as an adult. Then the next is that we need to connect the past to the present. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, how does my past affect me today as a parent? How does my past affect me today in my work? How does my past affect me today in terms of how I feel about myself? But that question becomes even more specific. How does the fact that I was raised with such trauma impact my ability to have a good time when I'm out with my friends? How does the fact that I lived in fear of saying no impact me today in creating healthy boundaries in the workplace for me? So that question becomes increasingly more and more specific. And then, what beliefs have I internalized as a result of my trauma and living with addiction? Are those beliefs helpful, hurtful? Did they help me when I was young? They may have, but do they help you now? Which ones do I want to keep? Which ones do I want to let go of? What beliefs do I want to incorporate into my life? And then lastly, skills, learning new skills. When we're raised with trauma and addiction, we develop skills. Some of us became good cooks because we had to if we were going to have anything to eat. Some of us became good listeners because we needed to be hyper vigilant just to protect ourselves. Some of us became really great at problem solving because we had to be extremely creative. So again, you get to keep the skills that worked for you if they will still work for you today. And that's important. Do they still work for you today? But oftentimes you're going to go out and you're going to need to identify other skills that you need to learn. Maybe you need to learn how to ask for help. Maybe you need to learn how to negotiate, how to get to a win-win versus lose-lose. Maybe you'll need to learn how to initiate, set limits for yourself, listen openly and respectfully. Those are the kinds of skills that we're often needing to learn. Now, where this tech takes us is, it helps us to create a new narrative versus to live the old script. I always say that recovery is about letting go of the script and having choice about how we live our life today. And that's what that new narrative is about. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to take some questions. But before I do that, I think I have a slide here. I wanted to ask you to think about this. What was the message in your life that you believe has supported you in developing some resiliency? What was the message? And the message may have been conveyed due to behavior. Could have been words, but it could have been behavior. And from whom did you receive that message? And I'm going to ask, it's one of the Jennifers, I believe, or it could be Marissa who's going to come on. If any of you are willing to put that in a chat so we can share it with everybody. So what was the message in your life that you believe has supported you in your resiliency? And from whom did that message come from? If a couple of you could just quickly put that in a chat, and I'll let them share that with me. So let's take about a 10-second pause here. Looking to see what my water is. Okay, let's take a 10-second pause. Let somebody put that in a chat. I don't see the chat number going up yet. Okay, and who's going to help me with my questions?
So I will be sharing the questions. Claudia, thank you so much. We have some really good questions. So one of the first questions we got was,
before you get to the questions, Marissa, let's see if somebody has answered my two questions that I asked here. Do you see that anywhere?
Yes, we have someone shared that they are very smart, and that was from their father.
Okay, good. And a second person?
Received a message, you're stronger than you think you are.
Mm-hmm. And who was that from?
You want me to share their name?
No. Where did they?
No. It was just that for that one, it's just the message.
Okay.
We also had somebody who had a father who was calm and quiet, but always left us a note in the morning when my mother was suffering from depression and could not take care of us. A grandmother provided a sense of strength. A scout leader shared with someone that they were a good girl. My mother told me that I could be anything that I wanted to be. A high school teacher told someone that they were capable. The message of hard work pays off was from someone's father. And from a mother and father, that I will be invulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'm glad you're willing to think about that. And for others of you, continue to think about that after this presentation tonight. And, we know that resiliency outweighs vulnerability. And the more we can build resiliency for ourselves and those that we work with, there are times where we cannot protect people enough. And, we can't necessarily take them out of certain situations at times. But there are certain ways that we can certainly support people in their resiliency. Okay, go ahead, and I'll let you ask me some questions.
Great. So one of the questions is it possible for a person to still feel the effects of childhood trauma and later trauma, even though the trauma was long ago?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I had wanted to make that point, so maybe it wasn't really clear, but that's what's most common, in fact, that even though, well, I'm in my 60s today, and I spent probably the first 18 years of my life living in a lot of fear. And I began my recovery very young in my life, in my 20s. And yet today, if I'm not taking really good care of myself, I can something I can sort of plummet into fear when I'm challenged with something, and that just comes from how much fear there was in my growing up life. And so again, if I'm not taking good care of myself, I can quickly revert back, and that's why I think recovery is an ongoing process as well. But the reason that we continue to carry those effects with us is because we haven't taken a look at what our belief system is. And many times we really haven't worked emotionally with our feelings. I think the belief system is probably the bigger factor. It's more of an unconscious that we're operating from beliefs that we didn't realize we were even operating from.
Excellent. Another question. During the presentations, many precipitating events to addiction were discussed. Is there ever a case where we can't identify a root cause, trauma, abuse, family dysfunction, yet someone ends up struggling with addiction or mental health or eating disorders?
Yes, there can be. There certainly can be. One is there could be a genetic predisposition. Somebody can be raised in the healthiest of families and had, all the supports in the world, and end up addicted at a young age. And particularly if they're addicted at a young age and yet you can't find any of those factors, that probably means there is something genetically going on. And sometimes they say, but yeah, their parents didn't have an addiction, but their grandparents may have had an addiction. That genetics can actually skip a whole generation. So that's the most common reason that I would see that. But I have to tell you, I get people who come into the treatment program that I work with, and they say, things were fine in my life, and I just started using with my peers, and people who really want to protect, so-called protect mom and dad, and they're not, and they just have denial about what it is that has been traumatic. I mean, I had a boy just the other day, and that his trauma had to do with his girlfriend suicided. Well, when he did a trauma timeline, he had a scene at home, a horrible scene at home, where the dad tried to kill the mom, and the mom took a hammer at him, and then they were moving across the country multiple times, and he was leaving homes and leaving schools right about the time he'd feel really good about what he was doing. And so you're a little suspect when somebody says, there wasn't any level of trauma. When they have a hard time identifying, maybe there's no blatant trauma, but the trauma, what set them up to think that who they were was less than, was not good enough? What set them up that when they drank, somehow it filled a hole in them that was so empty, and they just wanted more to just feel normal again? But I do want to say too, again, peer influence is strong, and usually with healthy parenting, you're able to intervene before the peer influence is such that somebody has just drank in such copious amounts has caused some changes that lead them to addiction. But so the answer is yes, but I'm always suspect unless it's just genetics.
Okay, great. An additional question is, what is the importance of using person-first language when speaking about addictions in an effort to break down stigma?
Say that first part again. What is the importance of using first person?
Of using person-first language when speaking about addictions in an effort to break down stigma?
I think that when you speak in first person, you're most apt to be speaking from a place of acceptance of who you are in your addiction versus without judgment. And I always sort of laugh. My husband would give me a bad time, flying around on airplanes, and somebody next to you always wants to talk, and they ask you what you do. Sometimes I try not to tell them what I do, but if they ask you what you do, they always have some story of somebody in their family. And, talking about addiction is just a norm for me. Talking about it in a way that I have such great compassion for and I don't have judgment about. And you realize that that's not where the rest of the world is coming from necessarily. They still have a lot of stigma associated. So I think the real value in that is when you speak, you're speaking from a place of compassion, empathy, and without judgment. And that helps to lessen that stigma.
Great. What is the best proactive approach to give children of an alcoholic?
I think that in terms of building resiliency is there's three things that particularly come to mind for me. So an answer to that question is, can we get them involved in something where they have a sense of purpose, meaning, and belonging? And that's often things outside of the home. Is there a way that we within the school system, we within our communities, can we get them involved, as I said, in something that provides either purpose, meaning, a sense of belonging that they can take a sense of pride in? Because in that process, they'll also feel a sense of efficacy. I think that healthy rituals, if we're talking about even in the context of a family, if you're the other parent who's not the addict and you're trying to maintain some health within this family system, healthy rituals are really important. One of the people said this, that you had a mother who was depressed and the dad left a note every morning. I mean, that is a healthy ritual. Healthy rituals, eating a dinner. Actually, the research says if you eat dinner 5 nights a week with the screens off and your TVs off, that's going to be significant. But 5 nights is really hard for a lot of families. But I always say, up to, if you're not eating at all, start with 2 meals in the evening. If you're already doing it twice, make it up to 4. But it could be having breakfast. It could be a ritual that takes place every weekend in which somebody gets their own time. So healthy rituals are important in the context of a family. And having somebody on the outside, somebody who's not caught up in that addictive system, to engage with you in a way that gives you a message that you have value, that you mean something to them. And that's why I asked you that question that I did. But just to give you an example, I had somebody tell me the other day, said, nobody, he said, it's like our whole family, nobody talked about what was going on. And I think there was just a lot of alcoholism. He said, in the extended family. And he said, but I had a neighbor. And he said, my neighbor worked on his cars. And he was a car fanatic and he was always working in his garage. And I used to wander down and, he said I'd wander down and pretty soon he invited me in and pretty soon he'd give me a sandwich and pretty soon I was spending hours there. And he said, I did that all my high school years. He said, he never had to talk to me about what was going on in my home. But just the fact that he spent that kind of attention and that I knew that he liked me. And he said he taught me a lot of things that today are helpful for me. So sometimes it may not seem like a big deal to us, but it can be life-changing for them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How does a practicing counselor or a counselor in training deal with the levels of trauma and loss that their clients bring?
One, you need to do your own work first. Or not first. I mean, a lot of us in the field didn't do our own work until we were in the field and then confronted with it. I always say, if you cry harder than your patient or a client or laugh harder than your client, that's a trigger that maybe you've got some work to be doing. So one, go take a look at sort of, again, it doesn't have to be trauma and addiction that you've taken into your life, but take a look at, I like to think that I'd be willing to do the work that I'm asking my client to do. And that it immediately begins with grounding, and do not underestimate. I mean, grounding, can be breath work in the context of sitting with you or being in a group where you just stop and ask everyone to take a deep breath in, a deep breath out. You have people uncross their legs and continue to breathe. You can do sensory motor psychotherapy techniques, the orientation techniques, 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you touch, to help them just be able to stay regulated as they can speak to you about what their experiences are. I made the comment when I spoke that the job as a therapist is to pace. And, by pacing, you can say, would you like to talk further about this today? And they can say, no, I think I've said everything I can say, meaning they've been able to contain themselves with this, but to say anything more, they don't trust their own vulnerability at this time. So pacing is really important. You know, I must say, the other day I was in a group with a young man that hung his head and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And it was with a newly experienced, not very experienced therapist. And at that point, I took over in the group because she absolutely did not know what to do. And she said, I didn't know if I should close group. I didn't know if I should close group and ask him to stay. I didn't know what to do. And I just slowly asked him questions that he could acknowledge verbally. Every once in a while, I'd say, you know, would you be willing to make eye contact with me so we could stay in the here and the now and the present? And he was able to talk through what a lot of that pain was about, just with it was a gentle voice. And I gave him some choices. A couple of things he didn't answer, and I didn't push. I backed away. But some of that trust in myself comes just with experience. And if you feel like you could be overwhelmed, ask for supervision. Ask for somebody to sit in on the session with you. Ask for someone to sit in on the group with you, or take those moments to a supervisor. I mean, you don't really trust in yourself until you have some experience.
Absolutely. How would you describe your theoretical orientation when it comes to working with families?
When it comes to family systems approach, you know, a Virginia Satir approach. I always say that when I work with somebody who's an addict, really the family is the client. And while the family is the client, everybody, I have an exercise that I love. You do some psychoeducation with the whole family, and the family, you know, is willing to be there. And then one by one, I have them note on a board, how do I contribute to the impairment in this family? And one by one, they tell you how they contribute to the impairment in the family. And then on the next board, how do I contribute to the wellness in this family? And this is about, if I know how I contribute to the impairment in this family, then that tells me that's the beginning of indicating what can I do so that I can take my part of contributing to the wellness. So let's say I have an 18-year-old addict, and he says, well, I contribute to the impairment by I lie, I cheat, I steal, and I use. And this older sister who's 20 says, well, I do the same thing. I lie, I cheat, and I use. And mom says, I blame my husband. I scream, and dad says, I avoid talking about the real issues. And then a 14-year-old says, I just go to my room and get on my computer. And I isolate. So now they all have identified something. And now with that, how can I take responsibility for trying to bring wellness into this family? It's a simple but very profound exercise. And it's a good exercise about the family as the client. We don't have an identified patient here.
Great. Someone enjoyed your example of the genogram. Is this a therapeutic tool that you regularly utilize when working individually with clients, perhaps to identify the baggage within themselves and the family of origin? And if so, when typically in the therapeutic process do you use it? The beginning, etc.
Good question. Okay. One, I think it's a great tool to use. I also think it helps to take sort of blame out. And for them to see that systematically this has been occurring. This isn't something that's just erupted in this immediate family system here. And sort of depends on how long, you know, what kind of program you're in, or is it individual counseling. I would do this relatively early. But again, I don't know if that means you have a 5-day workshop you're doing with families, or if you've been working for 3 years. But I would do it relatively early. You don't do it with families where people are in denial, or families are resistant for even being there. It's got to be a family that wants to be there, but early in the process. I also wanted to tell you about another genogram I do. remember the slide, and I don't know if I can go back and find it. I don't know if I'm going to lose. It was on shame. I think I can get it fairly quick. Okay, it's not coming as quick as I wanted it to come. So it was on shame. It was a circle. It said shame in the middle, and it said perfectionism, procrastination, control, rage, etc. I do that as a genogram. And so with all of those places it goes to, I put mom, dad, and self. And then as I talk about them, to what degree is this problematic for you today? To what degree did you see this acted out on your parents in your growing up years? So if we're dealing with is controlling behavior, to what degree is that problematic for you today? And you do a like scale 1 to 10. So somebody will say, well, I think for me today, it's a real significant problem. At least my wife and all my kids tell me that. So I put myself as at an 8. In your growing up years, to what degree was that a problem for your mother or your father? So that's a totally different kind of genogram, and it is a wonderful genogram.
Great. How do you deal with a dual diagnosis, specifically bipolar disorder and addiction? Is the first step regulating meds, or is it addressing the mental health disorder?
Okay. With somebody who's bipolar, medication works really well, but sometimes you have to find the right medication. And you would immediately want to work with that. But it isn't linear. It isn't that, gee, I'll work with the bipolar, and when we get that stabilized, we will work with the addiction. There really is an overlap fairly quickly, just because the nature of the crisis, the potential for crisis is great the longer they're untreated bipolar, and the longer they're still active in their addiction. And so when people come into my program, we will work with both really at the same time. And I think we see a lot more of that today. We even see that with different multi-addictions. Mm-hmm. As I say, somebody comes in, they're further along in the progression of the disease. This is where the crisis is, but we're quickly assessing, is there any potential other addiction going on here? And we won't wait a year for them to be in recovery from one before we're going to address the other. We won't address them both on the same day, but we're certainly assessing for the possibility on the same day. Mm-hmm. And we're assessing for the possibility of mental health issues with addictions on the same day. And in some ways, I love bipolar because it's so responsive to medication, which is very different than a dysthymia, depression, even major depression sometimes.
Absolutely. Which scenario would you determine to be more damaging to a child? A child who must witness/live in the midst of an extended, acrimonious divorce, including an ongoing custody battle. Despite the child being young, they still perceive the sense of heavy stress of it. Keeping in mind that with this ongoing battle, there is a possibility that the child will end up in the full custody of the non-addicted, emotionally supported, and connected parent, or a child who experiences the repercussions of living in a shared 50-50 physical custody arrangement in which one parent is an addict and a childhood sexual abuse victim who has never recovered from their own childhood trauma.
That's a loaded question.
It is.
And, you know, I also hesitate because somebody could be right in the middle of a court case on this one. They said, Claudia Black says, I really can't give you a consult. I do want to say that I do see people try and keep addicted parents away from their kids. And depending on what that behavior is, that's not always in the best interest of the child, because well, I grew up in an alcoholic home, and I have to tell you, I felt a lot more love for my alcoholic father than I did my mother. And I mean, he was much more affectionate, appropriately affectionate with me. He gave me a lot of really positive messages. And so I think some of my thinking is certainly influenced by my own experience there. I think that I hesitate to just really offer an opinion there because I don't want to make it a consult without more information.
Absolutely.
I think that when it comes to divorce, well, it's just so hard, particularly if there's been addiction and trauma, and people come with a whole lot of baggage, being able to, first and foremost, what's the best interest of this child here? And I have to tell you, I've never seen such acrimonious divorces I've seen in the last 10 years. And yeah. Okay, another question?
So is initial assessment for the possibility of co-occurring disorders a best practice?
Yes. Yes.
Great.
I think another best practice is when you work with addiction, you want to rule out certain things. One of the things I don't think I did say is that when you work with somebody who's actively addicted, today as I work with young adults, I want to rule out sexual assault. It's very rare to get a female between 18 and 26 who's an addict to substances who's not been sexually assaulted in the context of her addiction. But we also really need to assess that for our males, because I get a lot of males in the context of their addiction who have been sexually assaulted as well. So I think best practices is ruling out versus ruling in.
Great. And I think we will end with one final question. If someone identified with so much of what you said, where would you suggest that they begin?
Well, one is tonight, and I wasn't able to see that, but you have some vendors that are available to you. You have a lot of sponsors. I did see that slide, and many of them would be a place to begin. For some people, reading is the place to begin, that you just, you're not quite ready to go talk to somebody, but you may want to read more about this. You may want to understand more about this. And so we have a lot of books. I have a lot of books. There's a fair number of books out there today that I think can be helpful to you. I think that you can begin by doing some of your own journaling and some of your own writing. You could begin by a self-help group. It could be a self-help group of adult children of addiction. It could be an Al-Anon group. It could be a Narcotics Anonymous group. So depending on sort of what you've done so far in your own wanting to take care of yourself. But to attend to this, we have a lot of resources available in your community, and I would use the most immediate people there who are sponsors to help get you connected. I also want to say, if you go to a Psychology Today website, and they have an icon that is a therapist locator, and you put in your area code, is your zip code, I've had really good results finding people that I find out what they specialize in. I find out what kind of insurances they take, if they even take insurance. And that can be a good resource for finding somebody as well.
Great.
I just really want to say to those of you who are therapists who are listening today, to take care of yourself as well as you take care of those that you're working with, and that you're just as important as those that you're working with. And to others that are listening to me, something that I said earlier, and that is, this is about letting go of a script and really having choice about how it is you live your life. And it's a wonderful process once we get through our fears. And but there's other people to help you as you walk through that initial fear.
Great. Thank you so much. And just one final reminder to everyone, somebody asked if the PowerPoint presentation is available. It was sent to those who registered via email, and it is also available on our website, hillsvalleycoalition.org, along with a link to explore some of the books that Claudia has written. So if you're interested in checking those out as well, she was extremely informative tonight, and she has a lot of history and knowledge to share with us.
And Marissa, I wanted to say the book Unspoken Legacy speaks to this more so than any other. I also wanted to say the handouts are reflective of the PowerPoints, but like the baggage card, I've given you a 2-page thing on the baggage card, and it will not look like the PowerPoints, but they are a summary of everything. Actually, it's even more specific. It's a better piece in which to work with. So while it won't look exactly like the PowerPoints, I've really given you everything that I think I spoke about. And I too want to just thank, I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank Marissa, Jen, Jennifer, and Gail Mangold again. Happy retirement, Gail.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, Claudia. You were absolutely worth the wait. I have to say, it was
Thank
an
you.
impactful evening it was. And I'm so happy. Thank you, Gail, wherever you are. I know she's watching, for her persistence, and thank you, obviously, to my co-hosts, Marissa and Jen. And as you said, please, for the people who are still on with us, please check our website, hillsvalleycoalition.org, frequently. All of Claudia's books will be on there. Also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and you can see all the things that we're doing in the future. Jen?
Yes, and thank you so much, Claudia, for coming in and working with us. We've had such a great turnout, and all the comments in the chat box, everybody saying thank you so much, and also to our providers. We had a little rough start in the beginning, but our providers are so important to us, and also the sponsors during this program. So remember, on our website, there's an excellent resource for all of our families and students and educators throughout the year. There you will find the provider listings, including videos and descriptions of all of their services. So we encourage you guys to utilize all of that information when you can, and if you need it for your family support. And again, we thank you guys all so much for attending this program this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you very much.